There's a Gemara that says that when you give a person a present, it's a mitzvah to inform them of the present that they are getting, because sometimes you get something and you don't realize what you're getting. So there's a din, it's a halacha, okay, that you're supposed to inform a recipient of a present about the great present they're getting. So therefore, I'm going to fulfill that mitzvah and tell you guys, because you don't realize it yet, what a great present you're getting. Okay, you're getting Rabbi Kimche to come and speak to us, which in it itself is a great present. And he's going to speak about something that's both dear to him and dear to many, many of you, and that's Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha. So we're getting a great, great gift. Just one or two words on Rabbi Kimche that was not up on the board, because I'm sure you saw it and how great everything Rabbi Kimche did. And what they didn't put up, because they probably didn't even realize it, is that Rabbi Kimche was connected to the foundations of Darchei Noam in the early years. He was a Rebbe, pretty much almost from the beginning, not quite from the beginning, but very close. And many of the things, many of the principles and techniques and methodologies and environment that the yeshiva is today, those roots were already set back when Rabbi Kimche was with us, and he had a major role in that. We have tremendous hakaras hatov to him for all that he did in the early years of Darchei Noam. It was with a very heavy heart that we let him go in 1984. It was our loss, but it was really London's tremendous gain. He made a tremendous, tremendous impact on London Jewry. Anybody who wants to just know about it, if you lived in London, whether you davened in his shul or you didn't, you knew about the impact he made. And we are very honored and very pleased and very appreciative that Rabbi Kimche is joining us to share words, and we're already alerting him. We hope it's not going to be the last time.
Thank you very much, Shia, for your very warm introduction. And it's really a very special event for me to come to this place. Medrash brings back wonderful memories, even though the yeshiva's been through various gilgulim since 1984 when I left. But certainly the ethos of the yeshiva and the ruach of the yeshiva has remained a constant. And I've heard wonderful things over the years. From Shia came to visit me regularly in London. And it's wonderful to be here in this place of Medrash and have an opportunity to meet all of you, the Talmidim here, the Rabbonim here. And thank you for inviting me. On the other hand, the subject this morning is an extremely sad one for me. The loss of a very close friend. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha, Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi, was a very special friend and colleague of mine throughout the 35 years that I served in London as a Rabbi of the community. For some of that time, he was the Chief Rabbi of the UK, but even before he became Chief Rabbi and after he stepped down, we had a lot in common, and we discussed things together, and we did simchas together and sadnesses together. And to lose him at his young age, when really he was in the prime of his life, is a tremendous shock to all his friends and colleagues. And I'd like to, in the time available, I mean, I could really, I could speak for 4 or 5 hours about Rabbi Sacks and his thoughts and his writings, but I don't think we've got that amount of time. But in the time available, I'd like to give you a little bit of a time of, first of all, who was the person and what was his innovations, what were his chidushim, really, that set him aside, and that was his uniqueness. Rabbi Sacks had brought a uniqueness to the rabbinate of the UK, and I could even say a uniqueness to the world fraternity of Orthodox Rabbonim in general. Let me start by saying that he was an inspirational leader. And when you heard him speak, he had a most profound combination, which is rarely found in people, of a formidable intellect. He was genuinely a genius intellectually. I'll speak more about that in a few moments. At the same time, a tremendously tangible passion. He spoke with passion and with intellect. And that combination of the heart and the brain working together and really reaching out to his listeners was something which was really very, very, very profound and very moving. But I'd like to start really from maybe a side issue of Rabbi Sacks, because he was first and foremost a rabbi, and as a Rav, of course, he was teaching Torah. And as we know, the primary role of Rabbanim to teach Torah is to teach Torah to Klal Yisrael. Torah Tibolonu Moshe, Merosha Kilas Yaakov. The audience of Torah is Am Yisrael, is Bnei Yisrael. And 99% of Rabbanim engage themselves in teaching Torah to the Jewish people. Rabbi Sacks, partly because he was chief rabbi, but partly because he was who he was, right, had a different role. In addition to the Rabbanus role, he had a different role. And his role was to be an ambassador to the Goy, an ambassador of Judaism, of Yahadus, to the Umot HaOlam, to the nations of the world, to try and explain to them what Judaism believes, what Judaism is based on, and what can they benefit from Torah. Now, this might sound a bit strange to you in the beginning, because historically, it's been very rare that the Jewish people have engaged in teaching Torah to the Ummos Ha'olam. That's not really our job to teach Torah to the Ummos Ha'olam. It's our job to live a life of Avodas Hashem, teach Torah to each other. It's internal. And yet, there is another side to it as well, which Rabbi Jonathan Sacks developed in the most amazing way. And I saw him, I think when David HaMelech in Tehillim Kuf Yud Tes says the pasuk, "Va'adabro ba'edosecha neged malachim v'loy eivosh." I will speak about your ideas and your mitzvahs in front of kings. David HaMelech says, kings meaning kings of the Ummos HaOlam. V'loy eivosh, and I won't be embarrassed. Right? When David HaMelech said that pasuk, he had Rabbi Jonathan Sacks in mind. And I've got no doubt that Ba'olam HaEmes, he got a Yasher Koyach, Rabbi Sacks got a Yasher Koyach from David HaMelech, that he understood this job. How does one stand in front of prime ministers and presidents and bishops and imams and the most significant world leaders and stand there and tell them about Torah in a way that they can understand the beauty of it and the brilliance of it? That was something, how many people in the world know how to do that? You understand that you're sitting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, you can't tell him a Tosfos. You can't tell him a Hakira of the Brisker Rav on the Rambam, right? You've got to tell him an idea, which is in his world, an important idea. So he would actually sit down with the Archbishop of Canterbury and with the top bishops in the UK and in the world and speak to them about morality, about social values, about the covenant that joins together members of a community, and the importance of building communities and what is a community with a shared value system. And Rabbi Sacks, in many ways, was able to do this in a unique fashion. His background, he came from a traditional Jewish family, and he didn't go to the yeshivas in the normal classical sense of the word like all the other Rabbanim, Orthodox Rabbanim who he worked with, but he made up for it by the fact that he was such an extraordinary genius. So he was self-taught in many ways. He did spend quite a bit of time with the late Rabbi Nachum Rabinovitz, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Malay Adumim. Some of you might have heard of him, passed away this year. But he spent many years in London, so Rabbi Sacks did learn from him, but he was mainly self-taught. And because of his genius, he was able to pick up and learn an enormous amount. But he was a star graduate of Cambridge and Oxford, as a matter of fact, in the field of philosophy. And he was on track to becoming a philosophy academic of the highest order. They wanted him very much to become somebody who in the academic world of philosophy could make major contributions in the academic world. Except that something happened to him. He went to America, and in America he spoke to a few of the Jewish leaders there. One of them was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zichron Livracha. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked him about what he's doing, and what he's studying, and where he's going, and one thing and another. This is a famous story which he told himself a number of times, but it's worth recounting because you see a moment of genius. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked him, so what about the other Jews that you meet in Cambridge and Oxford? What's their situation? He says, well, 90% of them are on a one-way ticket out of Judaism. They're assimilating. And the Rebbe said to him, so what are you doing about that? So he said, really, what am I doing about that? I'm just a university student and I'm going to be a lecturer. He said, no. If you're there, that means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you there and you have a tafkid, you have a role to play. What are you doing to prevent young people assimilating out of Judaism? Are you making them proud to be Jewish? Are you explaining to them what Judaism is about in a language that they can understand? What are you doing about it? And Rabbi Sacks said that question bounced around in his head for months afterwards. And because of that question, he changed his life. He decided not to become an academic. He decided to get into Rabbanos, and he started teaching. And he had a way of talking to students, young men and women, intellectuals, to explain what it meant to be a part of Klal Yisrael, what was unique about the Jewish people. He wrote over 30 books. One of the books that he wrote is called A Letter in the Scroll. I don't know if you've ever come across the book. If you have not read the book A Letter in the Scroll, it's required reading for everybody. It's one of the most powerful outreach books in English written. The title, A Letter in the Scroll, is based on a vort of the Baal Shem Tov, where he says the whole of Klal Yisrael is one Sefer Torah, and every member of Klal Yisrael is one letter in that Sefer Torah. And if you walk away from Yiddishkeit, the Sefer Torah is without that letter, missing a letter. You need to be there in order for Sefer Torah to be a kosher Sefer Torah. And the letter in the scroll is a very passionate cry to young men and women not to walk away from Judaism and what Judaism has to offer them, as opposed to the secularized, pluralistic, multicultural world that has very little to offer. And he was able to express this in the most remarkable way possible. I saw him discussing publicly Buddhism with the Dalai Lama. I don't know if you're going to know who the Dalai Lama is, but he's one of the Gedolim of the Buddhists from Tibet and one of the spokespeople of Buddhism to the world. And there was Rabbi Sacks publicly discussing with him. It wasn't really a debate, but they discussed together. And Rabbi Sacks was able to elucidate some of the principles of Ivdos Hashem b'simcha and meditation and tefillah, and he was able to be a Kiddush Hashem, to sit with the Dalai Lama in front of a public, a televised public, and discuss Judaism and Buddhism in such a way that people came away thinking, wow, Judaism is at least as interesting and important as Buddhism is, right? And we should pay more attention to it. This was a role which hardly any other Orthodox rabbi on planet Earth was either willing or capable of playing. He would have public debates with scientists who were militant atheists and discuss with them science and theory of science and the limits of science and why science really misses completely the point which Judaism addresses. Incidentally, there's one book, I've already mentioned to you one book of his, but there's another book of his which is worth reading, which is called The Great Partnership. The Great Partnership is a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. And what is the partnership? The partnership is Torah and science. That's the partnership, right? And for Rabbi Sacks, Torah and science is the left-hand side of the brain and the right-hand side of the brain. In other words, science is the left-hand side of the brain, analyzing nature and analyzing the world and finding out how it works and coming up with new technology to make it work better. But it doesn't even touch the whole question on the right-hand side of the brain, which is, what is the purpose of it? What is the meaning of it? Why are we doing it at all? Who are we connecting with? What are our relationships? Is there any transcendent value in it? And the combination of Torah and science is the great partnership. But if you just live in your left-hand side of your brain and you're a scientist, a secular atheistic scientist, you're missing out on the whole transcendent dimension of human experience and of morality and of connecting with the purpose for which man was brought into this world. And he was able to sit in front of an academic audience with the most militant atheist, Richard Dawkins. Some of you might have read Richard Dawkins, The God Illusion. He wrote a book called The God Illusions.
Delusion.
Quite good word. Delusion's worse. Yes, delusion's worse than illusion. Thank you, Shai. The God Delusion. Thank you. Yes, which was designed. He writes this scientist who writes this book. It's a brilliantly written book, and it sold millions. It was mamash makalkel. It really destroyed the emunah of who knows how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of young Jewish people. And he writes in an introduction, let me tell you what the purpose of this book is. The purpose of this book is that if when you open this book, you had some sort of belief in God, my goal is that by the time you finish this book, you won't anymore have any belief in God. You'll find it absurd to have a belief in God. That's why he wrote the book, and that's what the book is for. And it sold millions. And Rabbi Sacks took him on a public debate, a televised published debate for hours, and really made mincemeat out of him in the nicest way possible, like only an Englishman can do. Rabbi Sacks remained an Englishman, modest, polite, understated, but at the same time went straight for the core issues, and it was a Kiddush Hashem. People who saw it suddenly realized, wow, scientific theory is good for certain things, but doesn't teach you how to live your life, and doesn't even touch upon the question of a life worth living and the purpose and meaning of life. And Rabbi Sacks somehow managed to really combat this man. I don't think there wasn't another Rav, because I knew all the Rabbonim in the UK for those years that I was part of that rabbinate. No one else could have done that. No one else could have done that. And he went in, as I say, in the nicest, politest way. But when he was in the chair, he was a gladiator. He was fighting against atheists, right? Using all the philosophical tools at his disposal, using all his erudite and formidable intellect, and he would fight for it. And this was something which was a tremendous chaos. And most of his achievements as a Rav were in the field of what I call an ambassadorial role for Yahadus vis-a-vis the Ummah Ha'olam. Let me give you a little source which you might be worth thinking about. You might say, where do we find in the Torah this idea? But that's our job at all. How are we supposed to know that this is a job at all? So there are lots of this is a subject for a whole share. Maybe once I'll give you a whole share. I'll just touch on one little detail. And that is, in Sefer Devarim, in two places, the Torah uses an interesting phrase, ba'er heitev. In the very, very beginning of Devarim, it says, Ho'il Moshe, be'er as a Torah hazaz, be'er heitev. What does ba'er, the word bi'ur means to explain? What does it mean, ba'er heitev? Moshe Rabbeinu started teaching the Torah ba'er heitev. What's Moshe Rabbeinu been doing for 40 years in the Midbar? Just teaching Torah min haboker ha'erev. Why suddenly now, in the last 5 weeks of his life, is he teaching the Torah ba'er heitev? What does Rashi say? Rashi quotes a Gemara and Seitar, and he says two words. Rashi says two words. Ba'er heitev, says Rashi, b'shiv'im loshen, in 70 languages. And this phrase ba'er heitev, with exactly this same Rashi, appears later on in Parshas Kisavai, where it says avonim gedolos, lahokim avonim gedolos, two stones, pillars of stone, v'chasavta aleim es kol divrei haTorah hazos, ba'er heitev. And again, Rashi says shivim loshen. And the Meforshim asked the question, what's the purpose of teaching the Torah to the Jewish people in 70 languages? What was 70 languages in that period? What ancient Greek and ancient Persian and ancient Akkadian and ancient Hittite, none of them knew how to speak these languages. Why would he be teaching the Torah in foreign languages to the Jewish people, in languages they didn't understand? What could Chazal mean by saying? Anyway, I won't go into it in detail. Look at some of the Meforshim there. The Tzavah Kabbalah, for example, and others follow him, say that Shivim Loshen is a metaphor. It doesn't mean that he was actually doing a multilingual teaching of Torah. It means the Shivim Loshen means 70 nations, 70 cultures, and it was telling the Moshe Rabbeinu was teaching Klal Yisrael that there is a universal messages in the Torah which you can give to all the nations of the world. All the Shivim Ummos will benefit. Now, they're not going to benefit from Hilchos Kashrus or Hilchos Shabbos, but there are Yesodus, principles of morality, principles of thought, principles of sanctity of life, of Tzelem Elokim, principles of family life, the importance of relationships, parents and children. There are principles of thought and principles of morality which we can share with Shivim Ummos. And this is one of the sources for this particular role. And the truth is, throughout Jewish history, we haven't done much of this. And the reason for this is because 90% of the time, Klal Yisrael are too busy simply trying to survive the non-Jewish environment. Right? If you have a non-Jewish environment full of pogroms and inquisitions and Holocaust and hostilities and anti-Semitism, you're not going to have a platform where you can communicate the beauty of Torah to the non-Jews. But Rabbi Sacks felt that Eis Lasses Lashem, that our generation, there is a willingness and an openness in the non-Jewish world to understand that there is something beautiful in Judaism, beautiful in the Torah. And when you read his Divrei Torah, you will see that he does this brilliantly. I'd like to give you just one or two little samples, time available, one or two little samples of his Divrei Torah to illustrate what I'm talking about. And just maybe just as a introduction to tell you, one of his remarkable gifts was to take a relatively simple Dvar Torah, a pasuk, a Maimah Chazal or something, and look at it and drill down a bit deeper into it. And suddenly he's talking about big issues, big ideas. He always said, this is one of the things he came back to a few times, he said, the non-Jewish world believes in the idea of power. It's military power, political power, financial power. In the non-Jewish world, it's the idea of power which controls the world. But in the Jewish mindset, it's not the idea of power, it's the power of the idea. The power of the idea to change the world. If you have a new idea and you understand it properly and you can communicate it well, ideas change the way you think. And if you change the way you think, you change the way you feel. And if you change the way you feel, you change the way you act. And suddenly you're a different human being. Avraham Avinu had no military power, no political power, and no material power. But he had an idea. In fact, he had two ideas. Avraham Avinu had one idea, which was Hashem Echad, the belief in the Rebbeinu Shalom. And the other idea was Chesed, that we're fundamentally obligated to spread Chesed in this world. And with those two ideas, Avraham Avinu changed the world. So Rabbi Sacks would say, we have ideas in the Torah. We have to find ways to share them with Ummos HaOlam. Okay, so here's one little drasha that he gave. Some people might have heard it, I don't know. Vayom Hashem el Avram, lech lecho me'atzecho, me'ladzecho me'beis avicho, el ha'oretz asher arech. First pasuk in Parshas Lech Lecho, famous pasuk. Avraham Avinu gets his first nevuah of his life, and he's told to go to Eretz Yisrael. Fine. Why does the pasuk need to say me'artzecha, me'moladdecha, me'beis avicha? Why does it need to say that? Just say, yeah, the pasuk could have said, Vayom Hashem el Avram, lech lecho el Eretz Yisrael. Who cares where he's going from? What difference does that make? What difference does it make where he's coming from? What is me'artzecha, me'oladdecha, me'artzecha from your land, me'oladdecha from your birthplace, beis avicha from your family home? Why is this necessary to be done? Thank you very much. So Rabbi Sacks really took this pasuk and he said, let's look at this situation for a minute. Avraham Avinu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created Adam and Chava, created the human being with a tzelem Elokim. The Tzelem Elokim means lots of different things. One of the things it means is that you have the freedom of choice. You can choose what to do. But he says freedom of choice is not a simple matter. There are many schools of thought in the world which will tell you that we live in a deterministic world, that the forces around us are so powerful that the freedom of choice is in fact an illusion. We think we have freedom of choice, but really we are driven by forces that are beyond our control. We are victims of deterministic forces in this world. And what are the three main forces, three main theories? So suddenly he starts talking about determinism in world history and in world philosophy. So I'm going to just overgeneralize and oversimplify this enormously and disgracefully, but I'll just do it for the sake of share. He says the philosophy of Marx was the philosophy of materialism, that really it is the powers of materialism and profit which control the world. Everything else is really subject to those powers. You think you have the freedom of choice, but really you're caught in a bracket of economic forces which control your life. You have no freedom of choice. We are caught in the powers of economics in which we live. That's Marx. Came along Spinoza, and Spinoza said, we are caught. We're doing all right? Spinoza, Rabbi Sacks always referred to Spinoza as my favorite Epicurus. That was my favorite Epicurus. Right? Spinoza spoke about the circumstances of your birth as being the determining factor of the whole future of your life, and he also clearly spoke about the fact that the freedom of will is an illusion. We don't have any freedom of will. Later on, of course, in our world, geneticists, biological geneticists would tell you the same thing, that inside your genes, your future is already predetermined because you have certain powers and tendencies and weaknesses and strengths and all put together inside of you. There is no freedom of choice. And then there is, he said, Freud. So Freud will tell you that your childhood experiences affect your subconscious at such a deep level that all future decisions of yours are really controlled from the subconscious. And again, freedom of choice is a myth. So we are dealing, said Rabbi Sacks, with a secular world in the last 200 years that teaches us at every stage along the way that we don't have really the freedom to live as we wish to live. And even if you wish to live a life of avodas Hashem, a life of morality, we're caught. We are victims. The whole concept of victimhood. Somebody does something wrong, and he says, it's not my fault. It's the fault of society. It's the fault of the poverty of society. It's the fault of my education. It's what people did to me. It's what my mother did to me, my father. Everyone's got all sorts of different excuses, and these excuses only make sense if you live in a deterministic world. If you live in the world of Bechira Chavshis, which the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva Perek Hey, that this is the Ikar HaGodol She'Hakol Tolui Bo. This is the Ikar HaGodol. Without an emunah in Bechira Chavshis, we have no Torah in Yiddishkeit. We have no Schar V'Onesh. I never understood why the Rambam didn't count Bechira Chavshis as one of his Shloshes Ve'ikrim, 13 Animanim. Okay, that's also a different share. But I call upon him, said Rabbi Sacks, Vayom Hashem Avu. Lech lecha me'artzecha. Leave behind. Artzecha means your wealth, your property. In the ancient world, all wealth was property based, whether it was agriculture or whatever else it was. Leave behind your property, your wealth. Moladetecha, from your birthplace. Leave behind the circumstances of your birth. Umi beis avicha, and the family of your family experiences. Leave behind all those forces which tend to make a person a helpless victim in a deterministic world, and follow the Rotz of Hashem. This was a challenge to raise himself beyond all these deterministic forces and exercise his Bechira. And in fact, in his 10 Nisyonos, this was the first of his Nisyonos. But I want you to pay attention to what's happened here in this short Dvar Torah. He's taken the simplest possible imaginable and turned it into a seminar on determinism and freedom of choice. Big pictures, big issues, dealing with the essence of what it means to be a human being, to take responsibility for your choices and not to claim to be a victim. So he would suddenly be speaking about big picture issues. How many people have learned and taught that first pasuk of Lech Lecha and have managed to get out of that an issue which affects all mankind? Hardly anybody. He had a unique ability to simply connect the dots in an original way in order to bring out the principles of humanity, of morality, of responsibility, what it meant to be responsible, to take responsibility for one's own, for one's life, And the issue of responsibility was also a recurring theme in his writings. Right? He wrote about, for example, the Chait of Adam HaRishon. But the real Chait of Adam HaRishon wasn't that he ate from this tree. His real Chait was that when he was confronted with the fact that he had eaten from the tree, he said, it wasn't my fault. She made me do it. That was his Chait. That was the Chait. It was because of that Chait that Adam HaRishon was punished. Had Adam HaRishon said what David HaMelech said, then David HaMelech was confronted by his Chait. David HaMelech's first words is Chotasi. What does Chotasi mean? Chotasi means I take responsibility for what I've done. I did it. I shouldn't have done it. I regret it. I want to make amends. That's what Chotasi means. But to say someone else made me do it is to abandon responsibility and to abandon one's Salam Elokim, that you are in control of your life. And all this he was speaking about on the first pasuk in Bereshit, in Parshas Lech Lecha. So Rabbi Sacks had this unique ability to teach Torah in an interesting way, mainly to intellectuals, if you like, to people who were in the more Western culture, the world of Western intellectual culture. Obviously, because he mixed a lot with non-Jews and with bishops and imams and Buddhists, he came under fire from the more yeshivish world. In the yeshivish world, this is not the behavior of Rabbonim, generally speaking. Rabbonim were not happy about the fact that he attended the royal weddings and the royal funerals, and he went to speak to Prince Charles, and he went to speak to members of the royal family. He became very friendly with them. So he came under criticism from the yeshiva world, and it upset him. Why did it upset him? Because it meant that they didn't understand really what his role was. He wasn't trying to become a Rosh Yeshiva or a Pesach. In other words, the Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, for example, technically speaking, is always at the same time the Av Bezdin of the London Bezdin. To be the Chief Rabbi of the UK means you're also the Av Bezdin of the London Bezdin. But he never ever exercised that right. He had Dayanim, and he listened to his Dayanim, and he encouraged his Dayanim, he supported his Dayanim, but he never ever tried to be a Dayan or to paskin halachas. He knew exactly what his role was, and he was very, very focused. And he was able to write one of his, I think he came out with 2 books here in 2020, both of which are connected to what I'm speaking about now. One of them is called Morality, in which he touches on ideas which he was able to communicate with the non-Jewish world. And the other one is called Judaism's Life-Changing Ideas. So he simply goes through all the parashas, and out of each parasha he extracts not a new chiddush in the Ramban or a new chiddush in the Arachayim HaKadosh, but an idea. Just an idea which is oiva l'seicha, which is something you can teach to any thinking human being. And that's what he was trying to do. He's trying to develop a bit of a new language. How does one explain Judaism and the beauty of Judaism and the power of Jewish thought to a thinking non-Jewish audience, and of course at the same time to a Jewish audience who are partly assimilated, who've grown up in the zeitgeist of today, which is so very pluralistic and valueless in a certain sense, not connected to any particular value system. And this was something that he really dealt with a lot. Maybe I'll just add one more Torah of his, which I think is very interesting, which is illustrative of his thinking, his broad-based thinking. Rabbi Sacks used to say, on a few occasions, that in the Torah, in the Tanakh more precisely, there are 3 different voices, what he called voices. There was 3 different ways of expressing the ideas of the Torah. One of them he called was Torah's Kohanim, was the voice of the Kohanim, and the Kohanim were responsible for Tumah and Tara and Issa v'Heta, and it was basically a law-based system. L'havdil ben atomei v'atahar, right, from Kodesh and Chol, like we say by Havdalah, to be mavdil, to differentiate between different categories of Tumah and Tara and Kedusha. That was the Torah's Kohanim. And if a person did an Aveira, he needed Kapora and Tahara. Yom Kippurim, the words Kapora and Tahara are part of the vocabulary of Torah's Kohanim. But he said there's a different voice in the Torah, which he referred to as Torah's HaNaviim. And the Navi, Ma'ashem Shoel Nimcha, Kiyim Avas Chesed, Matznei Aleches, Tzedek Mishpat, Chesed and Rachamim. The Navi wants you to develop virtues, to develop midas Torahs, to become people of Chesed, V'rastichli, V'tzedek, V'mishpat, V'chesed, V'rachamim. This is the language of the Navi. And if a person does an Aveira, the Navi will tell you the main thing is not Kapora and Tara, the main thing is Tshuva. And what's the difference in Tshuva on the one hand and Kapora? That's also a separate chair. But he used to say there is a difference, an important difference between Torah's Kohanim, Torah's Hanavim, and then there is a third voice, which is more in the Ksuvim. So there's Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. In the Ksuvim, there is the voice of the Melech, what he called the voice of the Melech, which is basically Shlomo HaMelech and David HaMelech, and that is Chachma. In Mishlei, in praise of Chachma. Pursue Chachma. Find Chachma and value it in every way possible. And this was the voice of the Melech. So when teaching this, so first of all, when he taught this, part of his agenda, incidentally, which he rarely spelled out this agenda, was that one of the things he was fighting against, again, I mentioned earlier that he was a gladiator, he had certain battles he was fighting in his life. He was also fighting against academic Bible studies. I don't know if many of you had contact with academic Bible studies, but in the academic Bible world, they don't believe in Torah min hashamayim. They believe, chas v'shalom, that the Torah was written by various different authors, different periods of time, and that the whole reform and conservative movement is based on the assumption that Torah is not min hashamayim, chas v'shalom. That the Torah is simply a human document. Right? One of the things that they say, the Bible critics, is look at all the different voices in the Torah. There is the voice of the Kohanim, the voice of the Nevi'im, the voice of the Melech. This is not all the same author. These are different authors, different periods, different whatever. Again, I'm oversimplifying terribly. Here, Rabbi Sacks said, look, I want you to understand that what these three voices are. And again, in order to explain them, he delved into his knowledge of philosophy. And he said, what happened really in the 1700s in Europe, what was called the Enlightenment? For the philosophers, what was the problem of the Enlightenment? The period of the Enlightenment was a period where the intellectuals and the leaders had lost their faith in God. They'd lost their faith in religion, right? And they were promoting new concepts, liberty, freedom, equality. These were all the principles. In the 1700s, you had both the French Revolution and the American Revolution, based on these principles of freedom, equality. Right? But they'd lost their religion. So the philosophers were interested in the following question. What's going to happen to morality? How are we going to base a society on morality if you don't anymore have a God to whom you're accountable? There's no code. There's no religious code at all. Can mankind develop of their own accord a morality which is strong? Right? In the absence of a belief in God. This was the challenge of ethics in the time of the Enlightenment. Hundreds of books have been written about this, thousands of authors given various different answers. But he said, in essence, there were three answers to this. One was Immanuel Kant, who said, no, we have an intuitive understanding of the categorical imperative. There are laws we have to follow, and we can develop a humanistic source for the laws of morality. And that is the foundation of morality going forward in mankind. Forget about religious beliefs. That was Immanuel Kant. Came along David Hume and said, no, that's a load of rubbish. We don't know what those laws are, and the categorical imperative doesn't work. We have to develop virtues. We have to have the moral system is based on developing virtues of kindness and generosity. more an Aristotelian model of what it means to be a good person. It's not a question of laws, it's a question of virtues. And then there is John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians who said, look, we don't care what motivates you, whether it's laws or virtues. What's important are the outcomes. So they developed a whole new different type of ethics, which was called consequentialist ethics, which was utilitarianism, which meant what's important is to have a system which provides the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, and doesn't matter what the motives are. This is the outcomes. Very briefly, Rabbi Sacks put all these three schools of thought together and said this is the Kohanim, the Nevi'im, and the Melech. The Kohanim are interested in the legal system of Tumah and Tara and Issa v'Heta, that's the Kohanim. The Nevi'im are interested in Barastekli, B'Tzedek, B'Mishpat, B'Chesed, B'Rachamim. These are midas, these are virtues. And the Melech is interested in running the country and having consequences, that having a country of law and order based on principles of morality. These three principles, right, are three different voices, but the Torah believes that these three voices have to work together. This is not a machlokas, right? In the academic world of ethics, this is a machlokas between these three views. But in actual fact, the Torah brings them all together and, of course, bases them on a deep emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, bases them on a deep understanding of the covenant, the bris we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that bris, he says, speaks that, he used to say the Torah speaks in three voices. There's the voice of the Novi, the voice of the Melech, right? The voice of the Kohen, and we have to listen to all these three voices. And these voices all connect to different parts of the human being. And that is really the message of the Torah. Now, I feel a bit bad having sort of so superficially characterized these Divrei Torah, Rabbi Sacks, all of which are very profound ideas. But just to give you a sense of how and in which way he was also addressing academics who understood these views in the philosophical system, he was also addressing Bible scholars and telling them, no, these different voices are not different authors, these different voices are different layers of meaning in the Torah. And we need all these different layers, one on top of each other, in order to engage the hearts and the minds of every individual. And the way in which he presented this was extraordinary. I'll just finish off, if you like, by one or two little anecdotes, right? So, for example, on the question of, he was often in front of a secular audience, and he was asked by some bright spark. I remember one woman academic gets up and says, Rabbi Sacks, tell us really the truth. Do you really believe in God? Do you really believe there's God the creator, that there's God, that you really believe in that? So he would say something along these lines. He would say, to say that I believe in God is a gross understatement. Belief does not describe my relationship with God. God is with me every minute of my life. I live in God's world. A life without God is unimaginable for me. That's not a belief in God. That's Shavisi Hashem Lemeg Disam. That's how he lived. He lived a life of a very deep personal emunah. Whenever he spoke about his personal emunah, it was captivating. He was a man with not only a formidable intellect, like I mentioned it earlier, not only a deep passion, but also a sensitive neshama. The neshama connected with the Rebbeinu Shalom in a very real way. And because of that, he was really fearless. He was also a lord. I don't know if you know, you Americans probably don't know what a lord is, but he was a member of the House of Lords in England, right? Which is a mishigas, but there it is. He was made into a lord, but it gave him a platform. He wanted it because he was interested in the world stage. He used to say his ideas on a world stage. Very few Rabbanim speak on the world stage. But he got onto the world stage and he knew that if he was a lord, he would then be filmed speaking in the House of Lords, and that would then become a national and an international phenomenon. And in the House of Lords, for example, he was a fierce fighter against anti-Semitism. And whenever anti-Semitism came up, some of you might remember Corbyn nearly became Prime Minister of England we had a real Nes Purim with Corbyn, right? He nearly by a hair's breadth became Prime Minister of England, and in the last moment, the British people dumped him. But there was a time when anti-Semitism was really on the rise in England, and Jonathan Sacks got up in the House of Lords and really clobbered the anti-Semites. That any party that tolerates even the slightest amount of anti-Semitism has lost all its moral credibility. And he went on to explain, what does it mean to lose your moral credibility? And he went on to speak about the Holocaust, and that the Holocaust was only possible because the German people had been brainwashed into a hatred and a demonization of the Jewish people, that they were willing to stand by and watch it happening. And all this in the House of Lords, surrounded by a completely non-Jewish audience. And then he ended up by saying, you shouldn't think that anti-Semitism is only a danger for Jews. Anti-Semitism is a danger for mankind. So the Jewish people are the canary in the mine. I don't know if you know what that means, Rabbi Sacks, canary in the mine, right? People, the miners went down deep into the ground, but there were sometimes toxic gases coming out of the earth. And sometimes the miners didn't realize it until it was too late. So they took a canary in a cage into the mine with them. When the canary dropped dead, that was a time for the miners to leave the mine. It says, we the Jewish people, we're the canary in the mine. Anybody who starts with anti-Semitism doesn't stop there. Ends up being a danger to mankind. But the way he presented it, the passion and the erudite skills that he was able to master were really very, very impressive. And I have a feeling that my time is up. I'm willing to take a few questions if anybody wants any questions or any responses of any sort. But I must tell you, it's a tremendous sadness for Klal Yisrael to have lost a man who was in many ways unique. And he was playing a unique role for the Jewish people, a world ambassador for the MS of Torah, for the universal message which Torah contains in every pasuk, knew how to explain it, how to present it, and we will miss him greatly, but he's left behind his legacy. He's left behind a legacy which is also formidable. If you're ever a little bit bored, you're sitting in front of your computer and you want to go onto YouTube and just type in Rabbi Sacks, you can choose any of his talks at random, and it's always a remarkable experience just to hear him speak and the way he presented it with confidence, with wisdom, and with humility. His humility was also striking to his friends, in the inner circle of his friends. To become a celebrity and become a voice on the world stage and still retain your humility is not so common as well. I remember once, with this I'll finish, sitting around the table with him, a few of Rabbonim, I think it was a simcha of some sort. Amazing things happen at the rabbi's table at simchas, all sorts of strange conversations go on. One of the Rabbonim said, how do you cope with all the world praise that you get? All the accolades. I think he just won the Templeton Prize or something. How do you cope with it? So he said, listening to compliments is not a bad thing, gives you a bit of encouragement. But I've got a piece of advice for you. He says, when someone gives you a compliment, don't inhale. Don't inhale. Listen, but don't inhale. And that's really what he did. He heard the compliments, but it didn't make him an egomaniac. He could have. But he didn't inhale. He retained his modesty. He retained his Yiras Shamayim, and his loss is a tremendous blow for Klal Yisrael and for mankind, for anybody who is concerned about the moral messages going around the world today or the lack of them. It's a tremendous loss for us. Yehi Zichro Baruch, his memory should be a blessing for all of us. Amen. Yes? Hit the spot?
Yeah. We're going to send it around. Yeah.